Hi everyone, it's Michelle here. Today I'm going to be showing you how I created a technique using baker's twine to create some dimension to stamped images. The stamps I'm using today are from a new release from the Alleyway Stamps, and it has all of these little treats like ice cream cones and cupcakes. I'm going to be using the lollipop stamp because I was inspired by the little swirl of the lollipop, which is what we're going to be following when I do the technique with the twine later. But first I'm just going to stamp a couple of these onto some die cuts, and I'm using a postage stamp die cut. If you remember a few weeks ago, I made some lunchbox note cards that were in this shape, and I had a couple of extra ones, so I thought I'd put them to use on today's card. And as you can see here, I'm just stamping three lollipops on each piece of paper, and I'm actually going to be making two cards at once since I have all of these supplies out, and this technique is going to get a little messy, so while you're getting your hands dirty, you might as well make two cards at once. And I pulled out a couple of really bright and colorful sheets from this this paper pad from My Mind's Eye. And I'm just going to flip through it so you can see. It has a lot of really bright patterns, and it just has some really great colors that we can use as inspiration for our lollipops. So I'm just going to go ahead and trim these down right now, and I'm trimming them to be 4¼ by 4¼ and this way it'll fit into a normal sized envelope. But I want them to have that square shape so that it can match with the postage stamp squares. And now you can see how they can fit perfectly as a mat for the postage stamp die cuts that I have. And I'm going to be following the little swirl shape inside the stamps with some twine. So I have some baker's twine here, and I've pulled out colors that match with the colors in the pattern paper. As I said, I'm going to be using the colors there as inspiration. And you can see the pack of baker's twine that I've pulled out on the right here. This one is from Doodlebug, and it has a bunch of colors that are supposed to be for like a baby boy. But I just pulled out the colors that are relevant to my card. So I'm using yellow, green, and blue. And I also pulled out my jar of Mod Podge, which is what we're going to be using to adhere this twine down. But before we do that, I'm actually going to be coloring in these lollipops first, just because the baker's twine isn't going to be covering up the entire stamped image. So I want to make sure there's some color in the background for the parts that are showing through the twine. So I just tested my colors on a scrap piece of cardstock to make sure it would match with the color of twine I'm using well. And I'm just going over the entire image with a lighter color and then highlighting the swirls with a darker color. And it really does not have to be perfect here because this is going to be covered up with the twine so you won't see the imperfections. But I just wanted to add a little bit of dimension with that darker color, since this is really quick and easy to do anyway. So then I pulled out that large jar of Mod Podge again, and I'm using a matte Mod Podge. You can find these at any craft store like Michael's, and you can find them in much smaller bottles than the one I have here, so you don't have to have this huge jar. But it's a really great tool to have because it's a good liquid adhesive, and it's also really great for putting on top of things like if you're doing a collage just to cover and protect it. So right now what I'm doing is I am just dipping my finger right in there, and I told you this is going to get a little messy. And it might feel really gross and sticky, but this will dry all nice and hard so that the twine sticks to the paper really well. So right now I'm just dipping my finger into the Mod Podge and then adding it to the twine little bits at a time, and then sticking it down following the swirl of the stamped image. And of course you can use any kind of stamped image that you want that has a similar shape. It doesn't have to be this exact stamp, and it doesn't have to be lollipops, but if you wanted to do maybe like the inside circles of like a flower stamp, or if you just have like a geometric pattern that you want to fill some of them in with this twine, this is a great way to just add a little bit more dimension and texture, and it's just something really fun and different because you wouldn't see this on a lot of cards. So I just think it's a fun way to use up a supply that you might have lying around. So the second piece of twine, I'm actually going to try a different technique, and I'm just dipping the entire twine into the Mod Podge just to get some over the whole thing. And you can see I'm kind of like rubbing it in with my fingers into the twine so that I'm covering the whole piece with glue at one time. And I actually like this technique a little bit better, so that's what I'm going to be doing for the rest of these lollipops. So I'm just going to fast forward this because this takes a little bit of time, but a little tip, you can see I have a wet baby wipe on the side there. So whenever your hands get a little too dirty, you can just go ahead and wipe it off a little bit. And it's best to go a little bit at a time so that when the beginning parts have time to dry a little bit, so they stay in place while you're moving the rest of it. And you can also see once I've put the swirl down, I just dip my finger into more glue and I just add it on top just to really seal it in there. But really just take your time with this and try to follow the pattern as much as possible, but if you go a little bit out of the lines, it's totally okay. Because we're going for like a fun whimsical look anyway, so it doesn't have to be perfect. So now moving on to my second set of lollipops. And this time I'm simplifying my coloring a little bit, and instead of doing those two shades, I'm just going with one because in the last one you couldn't really see the shading that much, so I figured you didn't really have to take the time to do that. And I'm just going back really quickly to color in the little sticks in my last card because I forgot to do that. So again, as I said, I'm just dipping the entire twine into the Mod Podge and then slowly working it so that it follows the swirl of the lollipop. So I just went ahead and finished off the rest of those. And once you're done, if there are some places that are kind of not completely glued down, you can just take a little scrap of cardstock like I'm doing here and add some glue under the edges. And if there's too much glue in some places, you can also just pick that up just so that it doesn't dry in like huge globs. And at this point, my twine was pretty much dry, but maybe it just didn't have enough glue, and that's why it's not sticking down to the paper as much. But it is pretty set in that swirl shape, so I don't have to worry about messing that up too much. And I just set that aside to dry since it is quite a bit of glue. And I'm going to concentrate on the sentiment now. So I pulled out a very simple happy birthday sentiment from another stamp set from the Alleyway Stamps called Rock Solid. And I've mounted it onto my acrylic block. And I have some orange colored cardstock that is a good match to another color in the background paper, but is not a color I've used for the lollipops. And I'm just trimming off a strip of paper that's slightly larger than the sentiment. And I just cut it into two, and it's the perfect width for my cards, which is 4¼ inches. And I'm wiping this down with an anti-static bag, and I got a little bit too much powder there, so I'm just going to go ahead and shake off the excess. And I'm going to put this on a piece of white scrap paper just so it's a little easier to see. And I will be doing some heat embossing, and that's why I put the anti-static powder bag down to prep my surface. And I'm using Versamark ink, and I'm just centering my sentiment in the middle of each of these strips, and then I'm going to pull out my little Tupperware container that has white embossing powder. Since this is the powder I use most often, it's really convenient to have it in this container to catch all of the excess. And after I put the powder on, I went ahead and just heat set that off camera. And now I'm back and it's all melted. So here are my completely dried lollipops with that dimensional twine. And before I assemble everything, I thought this postage stamp was blending in a little too much with the background, so I just freehand drew some lines with a pen. This is a Project Life pen, but you can use any felt tip marker kind of pen. And I'm just adhering everything flat down with my tape runner to keep it really simple and easy. And you have that dimension from the twine anyway, so I figure it doesn't really need too much dimension. And then I have some white cardstock. This is a 100-pound cardstock that I'm going to be using for my base. So I just cut it into an 8.5 by 8.5 inch square and then cut it in half again. And now I'm scoring it at 4 1/4 to make two square shaped card bases. And once I have those, I can just adhere my card fronts directly to this card base. So that finishes off the cards. I think they're really cute, especially in this square format. And it's just a really fun look to have that dimension from the baker's twine. And as I said before, you can really try this technique with any stamps you have, and I think it'll just add a little bit of whimsy and fun and something different to your cards. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Make sure to subscribe to the Alleyway Stamps and my YouTube channel. And I also have some other recent videos on screen here in case you want to check those out. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll come back soon.